The jeep slowed at the crossroads, its engine ticking unevenly in the cold. The men inside wore American uniforms, mud-stained jackets, steel helmets pulled low, rifles resting casually between their knees. They looked tired, impatient, ordinary. When the sentry stepped forward, boots crunching on frozen gravel, he did not raise his weapon. He asked a routine question instead, something simple, meant only to confirm identity. The answer came quickly, too quickly. The accent was almost right, the words familiar, but something in the tone felt rehearsed. The sentry hesitated. Snow drifted across the road in thin sheets, muffling sound. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thumped dully, the echo rolling through the trees. The pause lasted only seconds, but it was enough to change what happened next. By the winter of 1944, when the Western Front had grown accustomed to uncertainty, units were rotated hastily, roads were clogged with traffic, orders changed by the hour. In the confusion of movement and cold, mistakes were expected. What no one expected was that some of those mistakes were being deliberately manufactured by the enemy. In December 1944, during the Ardennes offensive, German forces launched a covert operation involving soldiers disguised in Allied uniforms. The purpose was not mass combat, but disruption, misdirection, confusion, and fear. At first, reports were dismissed. Soldiers claimed American MPs had given wrong directions. Road signs appeared turned the wrong way. Convoys vanished into unfamiliar territory. Commanders blamed exhaustion, poor maps, or panic. The front was fluid. Errors were inevitable, yet the pattern persisted, in subtle but consistent. The atmosphere along the roads reflected growing unease. Checkpoints multiplied, voices dropped, questions became sharper. The smell of fuel and wet wool hung in the air as soldiers studied one another more closely than before. Familiar uniforms no longer guaranteed familiarity. Civilians felt it too. Villages near the front were filled with passing troops who spoke the same language but behaved differently. A shopkeeper noticed that some Americans paid with the wrong coins. A farmer heard soldiers arguing over road names locals knew by heart. These were small things, easily overlooked, until they weren't. What German planners understood, and Allied forces would learn the hard way, was that deception did not require perfect disguise. It required doubt. Once doubt took hold, every encounter slowed. Every decision carried risk. The battlefield became as dangerous behind the lines as at the front. By the time Allied command grasped the scale of what was happening, the damage had already begun, not in territory lost, but in trust eroded. Somewhere on those frozen roads, German soldiers were moving freely, not by force, but by imitation, and the war briefly turned inward, soldiers watching soldiers, unsure who truly belonged. The first question Allied commanders asked was not dramatic. It was practical, almost administrative. Why were so many routine movements going wrong at the same time? Reports arrived from different units describing similar problems. Convoys misdirected, bridges missed, patrols delayed by instructions that later proved false. Each incident, taken alone, could be explained by fatigue or confusion. Together, they suggested something else. Headquarters staff began comparing after-action notes under poor lighting, maps spread across tables stained with coffee and damp gloves. Timelines overlapped too neatly. The errors clustered along key routes feeding the front. They appeared shortly after the German offensive began, then multiplied as the fighting intensified. The coincidence was difficult to ignore. At first, suspicion fell on communications. Radio interference was common in the Ardennes, where hills and forests distorted signals. Units often relied on verbal instructions passed at road junctions. A wrong turn here or a delayed arrival there did not seem extraordinary in winter conditions. Yet experienced officers noted that the mistakes were directional, not random. And the mystery deepened when eyewitness accounts were compared. Soldiers described being stopped by American military police who later could not be identified. Others recalled receiving orders from officers whose names did not appear on unit rosters. In several cases, the uniforms were correct, the vehicles authentic, but the behavior felt wrong. Too confident, too hurried. Civilian testimony added another layer of unease. Villagers spoke of Allied soldiers who asked strange questions about bridge capacities, command posts, or road distances rather than immediate tactical needs. Some used American slang incorrectly. Others mispronounced place names locals heard daily. These details filtered upward slowly, often dismissed as a misunderstanding. The central question took shape quietly. Were these simply the byproducts of chaos? Or was the enemy operating behind the lines? The idea was uncomfortable. Allied doctrine assumed that German forces lacked the resources to mount deep infiltration on a meaningful scale so late in the war. The German army was supposed to be retreating, not improvising, yet intelligence officers were trained to distrust assumptions. They asked what kind of operation could produce confusion without open engagement. Sabotage explained some incidents, but not the confidence with which false orders were given. That required proximity, authority, and disguise. By mid-December, the mystery sharpened into a dangerous possibility. If German soldiers were wearing Allied uniforms, then every checkpoint, every conversation, every routine interaction became suspect. Or the question was no longer how many mistakes had occurred, but how many had been deliberately engineered and how far the deception had already spread. The investigation's focus narrowed toward a specific stretch of terrain, the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. Dense forests, narrow roads, and small villages defined the landscape. In winter, fog clung low to the ground, blurring distances and muting sound. Snow softened footsteps and erased tracks within hours. It was a place where direction mattered and where being lost could be fatal. The Ardennes was the primary axis of the German winter offensive launched in December 1944. The region's infrastructure, bridges, crossroads, fuel depots, was limited and critical. Control of roads often mattered more than control of ground. And this made the area ideal, not only for armored thrusts, but for deception. In one small Belgian village near a major crossroads lived an ordinary civilian, a middle-aged shopkeeper who had spent the war navigating occupation, shortages, and shifting authority. His shop sold bread, candles, and whatever could be sourced locally. The smell of damp wood and stale flour filled the interior. He spoke limited English, enough to trade with Allied soldiers, and passable German learned under occupation. Since the arrival of Allied forces months earlier, the shopkeeper had grown accustomed to uniforms. Americans passed through daily, asking for directions, matches, or hot water. Their behavior followed patterns: casual speech, unfamiliarity with local geography, and a tendency to gesture broadly at maps. He noticed these things without thinking much of them. Then, one afternoon, a group of Americans entered his shop who did not fit the pattern. Their uniforms were correct, but their questions were oddly specific. They asked about bridge load limits, road distances to named villages, and the location of a nearby headquarters building that no ordinary patrol should have known about. Their accents were inconsistent. One pronounced a village name as it appeared on maps, not as locals said it aloud. The shopkeeper answered cautiously. Years of occupation had taught him restraint. He noted another detail. When paying, one man produced currency awkwardly, as if unfamiliar with it. The exchange was brief, polite, and unsettling. When they left, the room felt colder than before. Later that evening, as dusk settled and the sound of engines echoed through the village, the shopkeeper mentioned the encounter to a passing Allied patrol. He did not accuse, he described. The questions, the accent, the way they looked at the roads, not the people. The patrol listened more closely than he expected. This was how the pattern began to take shape, not through intelligence reports or intercepted orders, but through civilian observation. In a war defined by uniforms and authority, it was an ordinary man, grounded in routine and familiarity, who sensed that something behind the lines no longer felt right. The patrol that heard the shopkeeper's account did not react immediately. Such reports were common in a fluid front, civilians confused by accents, soldiers unfamiliar with terrain. Still, the details were recorded, names of villages mentioned, descriptions of uniforms, the time of day. The patrol leader noted the emphasis on roads and bridges, then moved on. The war offered little time for curiosity. Elsewhere, similar fragments were accumulating. At a crossroads several kilometers away, an American truck driver recalled being waved down by military police who redirected him toward a secondary road. The instructions were clear, authoritative, and wrong. The driver followed them, only realizing the error after encountering a roadblock manned by unfamiliar troops. The delay cost hours. In another village, a civilian noticed road signs had been subtly altered overnight. Arrows reversed, destinations swapped. The changes were neat, professional, and brief. By morning, convoys were flowing the wrong way. Engineers corrected the signs by midday, but the confusion lingered. No sabotage charges were found. No tracks remained in the snow. Allied units began to notice behavioral inconsistencies. Some Americans asked for passwords without knowing the correct countersign. Others used ranks incorrectly or addressed officers with unfamiliar forms. These were small errors, easily attributed to stress, yet they clustered in areas of heavy movement, near key junctions and bridges. The shopkeeper's report gained weight when a second civilian described a similar encounter. This time, the Allied soldiers asked how far it was to a fuel dump and whether tanks could cross a particular bridge. The questions suggested planning rather than navigation. The civilians did not accuse. They described as they had learned to do. Military police responded by tightening checkpoints. And the soundscape changed. Boots halted vehicles more frequently. Engines idled longer. Questions were repeated. The smell of exhaust thickened at roadblocks as columns backed up. Soldiers studied faces more closely than before, searching for something they could not yet name. Initial suspicion did not point to a large operation. Intelligence officers considered the possibility of isolated infiltrators, small teams exploiting chaos. This was not unprecedented. German units had used deception before, though rarely at this scale. The breakthrough came not from a single arrest, but from convergence. Reports from different units, civilian observations, and MP logs began to align. The incidents were not random. They formed corridors of confusion aligned with German objectives. The errors were directional. The questions were purposeful. By the end of this phase, Allied command did not yet know who was responsible, but it understood the nature of the threat. Something was moving behind the lines, wearing familiar clothing and speaking a familiar language imperfectly. The danger lay not in gunfire, but in trust. And trust, once questioned, began to slow everything it touched. Once the pattern was acknowledged, Allied intelligence shifted from reaction to reconstruction. Reports were no longer filed as isolated mishaps, but compared for overlap. Maps were marked with pins showing where false directions had been given, where signs had been altered, and where suspicious Allied patrols had been seen. The clusters formed narrow corridors aligned with German advance routes through the Ardennes. Military police units were ordered to document accents, phrasing, and procedural errors. Soldiers were asked not just what had been said, but how it had been said. Misused slang, incorrect unit references, and unfamiliarity with American routines became data points rather than anecdotes. These were subtle clues, but in intelligence work, subtlety often mattered most. Civilian reports were now treated differently. Shopkeepers, farmers, and railway workers were questioned carefully, not aggressively. Their value lay in normalcy. They knew how Allied soldiers usually behaved when tired, hungry, or lost. When civilians described soldiers who asked the wrong kinds of questions about command locations rather than food or shelter, those descriptions were forwarded up the chain. Counterintelligence officers reviewed known German capabilities, and they noted that special units trained in deception existed within the German army, though rarely used so boldly. The possibility emerged that this was not ad hoc infiltration, but a planned operation exploiting Allied momentum and overconfidence. At checkpoints, procedures tightened. Passwords were changed frequently. Soldiers were required to answer questions about baseball, movie stars, or hometown details. Cultural markers difficult to fake under pressure. The sound of engines idling at roadblocks became constant. Tempers shortened. Rifles were held more tightly. One decisive clue came from an arrested suspect who failed a routine identity check. His uniform was American, his papers convincing, but his answers revealed gaps. He knew the rank insignia, but not the informal terms soldiers used for them. He knew the road numbers, but not the nicknames troops gave them. Under questioning, his German accent surfaced briefly. Interrogations confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. German soldiers had been deployed in small teams wearing Allied uniforms to spread confusion behind the lines. Their orders emphasized misdirection, sabotage of signs, and false instructions, not combat. By the end of the investigation phase, Allied command understood the threat clearly. This was not a rumor or coincidence. It was a deliberate deception campaign designed to slow response and fracture trust. The clues had been there from the beginning, scattered across roads, conversations, and civilian encounters. Only when they were assembled did the picture become undeniable. The war behind the front lines had taken on a new shape, one where observation mattered more than firepower, and where a wrong answer at a checkpoint could be as dangerous as an enemy ambush. As the scope of the deception became clearer, the atmosphere behind Allied lines shifted noticeably. Roads that once flowed with steady traffic are now clogged with delays. Vehicles idled under gray skies while soldiers were questioned, re-questioned, and searched. Engines hummed impatiently. Boots crunched in the now as guards paced. The smell of exhaust mixed with cold air and wet wool, heavy and persistent. Trust, once assumed, was now provisional. Uniforms no longer settled doubts. Every encounter carried a pause, a moment where eyes lingered too long on insignia, accents, and posture. Soldiers grew tense, aware that hesitation could be fatal, yet knowing that overreaction could be just as dangerous. Rifles were raised more quickly, voices sharpened at checkpoints. Allied command responded with increasingly strict measures. Password systems changed repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single day. Roadblocks multiplied at key junctions, often manned by exhausted troops unfamiliar with counterintelligence work. These measures slowed German infiltrators, but they also slowed Allied movement. Precisely the effect the deception was designed to produce. Civilians felt the strain as well. Villagers who had learned to navigate occupation and liberation now faced renewed suspicion. Shops closed early. Windows were shuttered before dusk. People spoke softly, wary of being overheard. In the presence of armed men asking pointed questions revived memories many had hoped were behind them. German operatives operating in disguise faced rising risk too. As scrutiny increased, their margin for error narrowed. Simple acts, mispronouncing a word, hesitating over a question, became dangerous. Teams that had once moved freely now avoided contact, focusing only on essential tasks. Some abandoned missions prematurely, aware that capture would follow even small mistakes. Rumors spread faster than confirmed intelligence. Some Allied units began to suspect everyone. Reports circulated of nervous soldiers firing on their own at checkpoints, convinced they had identified infiltrators. Commanders struggled to restore discipline without relaxing security, and the psychological effect of the deception threatened to become as damaging as the deception itself. The weather amplified the tension. Fog rolled through valleys, limiting visibility to a few meters. Snowfall muffled sound, making footsteps seem closer or farther than they were. At night, headlights were dimmed or covered, casting narrow beams that revealed faces only at the last moment. Every shadow seemed capable of concealing intent. By this stage, the deception had achieved its core objective. German soldiers disguised as allies no longer needed to act boldly. The fear of their presence had altered behavior across the front. Movement slowed. Decision-making hesitated. The battlefield behind the lines grew inward-looking, consumed by suspicion. The rising danger lay not only in the infiltrators still at large, but in what the deception had done to cohesion. The Allies now faced a secondary conflict, one fought in whispers, checkpoints, and glances, where the enemy's greatest weapon was doubt itself. The decisive confirmation arrived not through rumor, but through capture. At a roadblock near a key junction, military police detained a group of soldiers whose uniforms were correct and whose vehicle bore Allied markings. Their papers appeared legitimate at first glance, yet the questioning lingered longer than usual. The men answered confidently, but not comfortably. One soldier was asked a simple question meant to calm nerves rather than provoke them, the name of a popular American baseball team. His hesitation was brief but noticeable. Another was asked to describe the layout of his supposed unit's barracks. The answer was technically plausible and entirely wrong. Accents thickened under pressure. The cold air seemed to sharpen every pause. When the interrogation intensified, the illusion collapsed. The men admitted their identities. They were German soldiers assigned to a special operation designed to operate behind Allied lines while wearing Allied uniforms. Weapons, maps, and altered road signs were recovered from their vehicle. The deception was no longer theoretical. Further interrogations followed quickly. Captured personnel described small team deployments, limited objectives, and strict instructions to avoid combat unless necessary. Their mission was not to fight, but to mislead, to redirect convoys, delay reinforcements, and spread confusion. The operation had been organized under SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. As reports reached higher command, the scale of the deception became clear. This was not an improvised tactic, but a planned special operation executed during the opening phase of the German winter offensive. Though the number of infiltrators was limited, their impact had been amplified by fear and uncertainty. The climax unfolded across multiple locations almost simultaneously. Roadblocks tightened further. Suspected infiltrators were detained aggressively. Some German operatives were captured. Others were killed while resisting arrest or attempting escape. In several cases, the disguise itself sealed their fate. Soldiers caught wearing enemy uniforms during combat were treated as spies under the laws of war. For Allied troops, the revelation was sobering. The enemy had not merely broken through lines, it had moved among them, spoken their language imperfectly, worn their insignia, and exploited routine trust. The battlefield had been compromised not by overwhelming force, but by imitation. By the time Operation Greif was fully exposed, its operational window had closed. German infiltrators still at large were hunted systematically. Checkpoints became more disciplined. Procedures stabilized. The deception, once powerful, lost momentum under scrutiny. Yet the psychological damage could not be undone immediately. Soldiers remembered the uncertainty, the moment of doubt at a checkpoint, the hesitation before trusting a familiar uniform. The climax of the story was not a single firefight or arrest. It was the realization that identity itself had become a weapon, and that for a critical moment in the winter of 1944, and the enemy had successfully turned Allied strength against itself. The exposure of Operation Greif did not end the Ardennes fighting, but it reshaped how the battle was experienced behind the front lines. The physical damage caused by disguised German soldiers was limited, a few bridges destroyed, a few units permanently diverted. Yet the strategic effect lay elsewhere, in time lost and confidence shaken. Movement slowed at precisely the moment when speed mattered most. Operation Greif was intended to disrupt Allied command, delay reinforcements, and sow confusion during the opening phase of the Ardennes offensive. Measured purely in material terms, it achieved modest results. Measured psychologically, it succeeded far beyond its scale. We Allied commanders were forced to divert manpower and attention to internal security. Military police units were reinforced. Combat troops were reassigned to checkpoint duty. Commanders spent hours addressing rumors, correcting false reports, and calming increasingly jumpy units. These were resources not spent on pushing back the German advance. The operation also exposed vulnerabilities in Allied assumptions. Uniforms, vehicles, and language had been treated as reliable indicators of identity. Operation Greif demonstrated that these markers could be imitated well enough to cause hesitation, even if not perfectly. Post-battle assessments noted that procedural trust had been exploited rather than broken. Allied after-action analyses, Ardennes, campaign reviews. For the German side, the outcome was mixed. The operation showcased creativity and daring at a moment when conventional options were limited. However, it also suffered from overambition. Many operatives lacked sufficient language skills. Equipment shortages forced improvisation. German command overestimated how much disruption small teams could cause once suspicion took hold. The fate of captured operatives underscored the risks involved. German soldiers captured wearing Allied uniforms while conducting hostile actions were treated as spies and, in several cases, executed. This reality limited how aggressively remaining teams could act once the deception was uncovered. For civilians in the Ardennes, the episode reinforced a grim lesson. Liberation did not end danger. Suspicion lingered long after the infiltrators were gone. Villagers learned that even friendly uniforms could bring risk, and that speaking up, carefully, could matter. In historical terms, Operation Greif occupies a narrow but revealing space. It did not alter the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, nor the war itself, but it demonstrated how deception, even when tactically limited, could exert disproportionate influence by targeting trust rather than territory. The outcome was a warning absorbed slowly by modern armies. Control of identity, verification, and procedure became as critical as firepower. In the winter of 1944, the Germans briefly reminded the world that wars are not only fought across lines on a map, but within the assumptions soldiers carry with them into every encounter. When the Ardennes fighting subsided and the front stabilized, and the deception left behind by Operation Greif did not disappear immediately. Roads were cleared, checkpoints reduced, and passwords simplified, but the habit of suspicion lingered. Soldiers who had lived through those weeks no longer trusted appearances alone. Even familiar faces were studied twice before being waved through. In official Allied reports written after the battle, Operation Greif was addressed with restraint. It was categorized as a special operation of limited tactical success but notable psychological impact. The language was careful, avoiding alarm, yet the implications were clear. The deception had forced changes in how armies thought about security behind the front. Training manuals quietly evolved. Greater emphasis was placed on identification procedures, layered verification, and behavioral cues rather than uniforms alone. Passwords and countersigns were treated as temporary measures, not guarantees. These lessons would echo in later conflicts, where irregular warfare and infiltration became more kimono. For German veterans, Operation Greif became a footnote rather than a celebrated exploit. Otto Skorzeny, its organizer, would later defend the operation by arguing that deception was a legitimate tool of war and that his men had followed orders. The controversy surrounding the use of enemy uniforms remained debated long after the guns fell silent. Civilians in the Ardennes remembered the episode differently. For them, the legacy was personal. They recalled the fear of speaking to the wrong soldier, the danger of offering directions, and the return of occupation-era instincts even after liberation. Ordinary routines, selling bread, answering questions, opening doors, had briefly become acts of risk. Historically, Operation Greif stands as a reminder that modern warfare blurs lines not only between front and rear, but between friend and enemy. The German soldiers who fought disguised as Allied troops did not win battles by force. They disrupted them with uncertainty. The operation's enduring lesson lies in how fragile trust can be under pressure. Once doubt entered the system, it spread faster than any unit could advance. Soldiers delayed. Orders were questioned. Authority hesitated. These effects lingered longer than the infiltrators themselves. In the final accounting, Operation Greif did not change the outcome of World War II. The Ardennes offensive failed, and Nazi Germany continued its collapse. Yet for a brief, a cold winter moment, the Germans succeeded in turning identity into a weapon. That legacy of deception aimed not at positions, but at belief remains one of the most unsettling intelligence lessons of the war.